maybe you could put it on here?
Yeah, perhaps it's can.
Thank you.
Yeah.
How was the lecture after the screens?
You don't really need to watch it, it's fine. Like this?
Should work.
Okay.
Alright. Let's set up your computer.
Sure, it's in my bag. Let me get everything for it.
Passport with the,
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I can do it. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so we
You
can
said you
take
need
this one. Ah.
You said you need the HDMI.
I can't believe so many people actually came.
Is it the PC or a Mac?
It's a PC. So,
Alright, let's see if we can find an adapter.
thank you.
We should have the HDMI cable here. If not,
And also if I could plug it in so that it doesn't
yes.
fall down during the...
Just a moment though, I need to figure out which is the power plug.
Sure.
Okay, so that's it.
Ta-da! Thank you.
And so,
I will,
need to get the adapter.
and I have to get logged into the internet as well, so I can,
Yeah, there's the...
we'll figure it out. Okay. Close Twitter and Facebook.
Password. So, the name of the network and the password.
Okay. This is the network.
Or you can just use the Aalto open, that doesn't require
That'll be
anything.
fine?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
We are working on it.
Would you mind, could I bother you to get me a tissue, please? Thank you. I'm getting over a cold.
Oh, would you like some water, by the way?
Yeah, please. Thank you. Let's see. Okay.
So while we're setting up, welcome all to the first Games Now lecture of 2015. And sorry for some last minute technical issues. We'll try to get things working
Yeah.
as soon as possible so that
Sorry.
we can get our show started.
In our system here,
Oh.
we can't use digital input.
Well, if you have another laptop, I can log into my Google Drive on another laptop, and yeah, that would work. Sure.
Surprise. So let's
Sorry about that.
Yeah. No worries. I have to take this out now. Yeah, but I would have to log into my Gmail and things on there.
Yeah, just make sure that you don't click the remember me and that.
No, don't worry, I won't.
Or you can use the Chrome agent. That's also suitable.
Thank you guys so much for your patience and for coming out. I'm so sorry for the delay.
There you go.
Thank you so much. So, gosh, do I... Oh no, I won't be able to log in actually, because it's double authenticated and it'll have to text me, and I can't get texts while I'm in this country. Let me try, let me see. Let me see. Maybe I can get texts, hang on.
You get your backup codes, you can log in on your own.
Se ongelma siinä.
Sorry, oh I can?
Siinä on aina komponentti. Se on sama minkä määrä adapteria.
Thank you. Sorry, just a second. I think I can get texts. Excuse me. Just can't answer them. Excuse me. my phone. We got it, we got it. It's fine.
Is everything okay?
Yeah, everything's great. Yeah, thank you. Everything is fine. Mm. Mm, mm, mm. Yeah, that's okay. Awesome. Okay. Pardon me.
Let's be so it doesn't shut down on me.
I would appreciate that.
And Windows P, duplicate.
Where do I do that?
Windows P, duplicate.
Okay. And then how can I just have my notes?
Because of the double as it's a network.
Yeah, I went to have the notes on my screen.
Then you probably need to
I
go
need to mirror
extend.
it, yeah. So then, how do I,
Of course it was.
sorry.
So typical. Why would I want that to be the primary? Really. Thanks a lot. Is it a PowerPoint?
Yes, well, if you just, it's a Google presentation, so if you
Can
hit,
you download it, then it will work.
yes.
Then you get your notes.
Ideally, I hope I get my notes if I download it. I think it might be
Typical
working.
IT stuff.
Sorry. Is it still connected to the internet? Yes, okay.
One moment. I'll be right there on the stage, helping them. Some kind of stuff. 2 minutes.
Okay, I have downloaded it, I think, to the desktop.
Ah, why did I do that?
I'm sorry.
Desktop, you say?
Yep, that should be it. And then the presenting view with the notes in one window.
Exactly.
Yes.
What? It's designed for more than one monitor, and only one is detected.
I'm sure it'll detect the other one now.
Where's the... There we go.
Okay. And then you can pull the notes back.
Yeah, there should be a button somewhere.
Yeah.
Swap.
Yeah, you just have to switch them, I think.
There.
Oh, we did it. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Everybody hear me okay? If I speak too fast, was that a positive hand? Okay, if I speak too fast, because sometimes I do, just put your hands up and also down. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I've never been to Helsinki before, so it's a real honor to have been invited by the university, and I appreciate your time today. My name is Leigh Alexander. I am a journalist on games. I have been the editor-at-large at Gamasutra, which is a game development website, for a number of years now. I used to be the news director there. These days, I do a column for Vice. I work with The Guardian here and there. I've been in The Atlantic and The New Statesman, as well as basically every video game website you can name. At some point in my life, I have probably done something there. Currently, I do a video series at Rock Paper Shotgun called Lo-Fi Let's Play, where I gently visit very old computer games. In 2014, I published 2 books about digital culture, gaming, and identity. They're called Breathing Machine and Clipping Through. I recently co-founded a design consultancy for indie developers called Agency with my colleague Steve Curran. I have a Metal Gear Solid 3 tattoo, and I play Tournament Netrunner. That's me. I focus on video game culture a lot, and I often get asked to go and speak about it. A lot of times I am asked about the trends, like, Leigh Alexander, please come and talk about trends. Trends. I know how to talk about trends. For example, diversity in the hardware platform space, accessible digital business models, democratized tools, all of them are disrupting the constrained commercialism and homogeneity that increasing budgets and corporate risk aversion have been creating in the console business. You got any of that? Right. So game culture in particular, gamer culture. To be honest, gaming culture has a few real problems at the minute. We've worked, all of us who love games, including everyone in this room, have all worked for years in some way to help people understand that what we do is good and that fun and creative and good for people. And these are still going to be the headlines that the average person sees about our world, which is not fair. And of course, this ugliness does not represent everybody. But we got here somehow. And for me, it would be nice to be able to talk about some of the issues in gamer culture that brought us here without facing, harassment and things. Here's one problem. No matter how much the games industry has changed, so many of us have stayed the same. We're all basically adults, and we still don't really have a cultural vocabulary bigger than, oh, look, a Portal wedding. Oh, a Triforce tattoo. I know what that is. You guys know what that is? Or we like to get mad on the internet. That's a big part of our culture. We want to buy the next thing, and we want our childhood back, and we're stuck. There are so many new voices and new platforms and independent games out there that are changing the way that the creative world thinks about games. As a writer, it's getting easier and easier for me to make the case that games are a cultural medium that can be about many things and by and for many, many people. And yet, I still have to deal with a lot of people, even young people, telling me that some of those games are not real somehow, or those players are not real somehow. They don't count. The vast majority of people doing games journalism still want or they need to focus mainly on consumer product culture. That means they put a number on something and they tell you whether or not to buy it, and that's it, really. And that's what their audience wants. Again, the conversation gets stuck. Interest in games in the mainstream is still primarily driven by new technology and sequels. Gamers are so excited about this animation loop that they're stuck in of being a gamer that sometimes I wonder if they can even tell anymore what a good game is or whether they like something or not. They're mad if the game gets a high score, they're mad if the game gets a low score. They buy it because they're supposed to, and they like it out of this weird sense of loyalty to gamer culture. The weird thing is I follow over 1,000 people on Twitter for some reason, and less do I even see people talking about games or the people who make them. It's always, the argument of the week, who's not apologizing for doing something, who's right or wrong about change, and who deserves what. To clear one thing up right now, it is my belief that everyone deserves to enjoy games, everyone deserves the chance to make them, and no one deserves to feel like they are legitimate because of what they like. No one. And I don't know why that's so hard to implement in our space. What we have right now in games, to me, is not culture, it's exhaustion. I mean, there are amazing little games everywhere, school programs, jams, touching essays, incredible meetups, taking place all the time, so of course it still can be quite fun to participate. But as a writer, I don't want to just celebrate the little games that I love only to the small audience that already likes them, especially as it kind of costs me a lot to keep doing this work in a very real spiritual way. I have to worry about my safety now when I appear in public. I used to be a confident public speaker, and now I'm a little bit of, even though I know that no one in this room is going to hurt me, I'm a little bit afraid nonetheless. Which is ridiculous because I'm just a games critic, That said, if you're willing to be mindful of my situation, if you post tweets or pictures about my talk, I'd really appreciate it. It sucks that we have to even think about that right now. But games are supposed to be about expressive play, creating, sharing. We've played since, before technology. Animals play to learn things and to socialize. Games are play as well. But it almost never feels that way to me these days. Feels like it's more about nostalgia and gatekeeping, competing to see who is the most pure. But the reason I work in games is because I actually believe I believe there's more good things going on in games than you would notice if you just looked at gamer culture. We are standing at the precipice of a moment where we have the power to change everything, to reject complacency, to protest commercialism, to embrace diversity, and to riot screaming toward our generation's glorious inheritance. Everything is telling me it's finally time. So that's enough about things I don't like. I'm going to spend the rest of today talking about things I do like, starting with the 1990s. Yes, I'm afraid that I am going to talk to you about music and culture in America in the 90s, and I promise that it'll all make sense in the end. I know you might not get all the references, but don't worry too much. You might not have to. Everybody I know makes fun of me for being such a big 90s fan. It's sort of embarrassing when things that you like are not cool anymore. I mean, the whole reason Duke Nukem Forever exists as a thing in this world is because people would rather, spend money than admit that something they love is over. But I do want to talk about times when I loved something, because everyone here has loved games for a long time, right? Why else would we endure, the disappointment and the culture war and the arguments? Didn't we once love games with a defining and superhuman love that helps make us who we are today? I think these days we're all hanging in there, waiting to feel that love again in games. We're hanging in there because there's something that we want back, I think. So here I am in 1993. I think I'm 12, maybe about to start the 7th grade. So do you have Saved by the Bell here? Do people know what Saved by the Bell is? Okay, some people are nodding. It is a TV show about kids in high school, and I think the kids were all played by 20-year-old or 21-year-olds. So cool kids with big hair, and one of them's on the football team, and la la la. So I was watching Saved by the Bell to get ready for high school, and I wore really bad scrunchies and stonewashed denim, and I listened to pop music cassette tapes, that were in at the time in the 80s, like radio-friendly songs. I even had a tape that was a Christian tape, and I didn't even realize it was a Christian tape. My family is Jewish, so I had some Paula Abdul tapes. Most people know her now as a judge on American Idol, but she was a popular dance star and singing star in the 1990s. She did a video called Opposites Attract. This was one of the most popular videos of 1990. She was dancing with a cartoon cat. It's not a kid's song, it just had a cartoon cat in it, because at that time they had figured out how to blend animation with real footage, and they were like, well, we can do this thing, so let's put it in everything, kind of how things are today. This song, I've read this song referred to by music critics as a really good example of what pop music was like in the country at the time. I quote the music critic Stephen Hayden. He talks about how pop music at the cusp of the 90s was very stuck in time and very childish. And he has a great quote about this song, and it is, quote, "It signaled that American culture desperately needed someone to wipe that stupid grin off its face." The 80s were pretty awful for me. I'd grown up playing computer games in the basement, engaged with the mysterious vocabulary of hypercard shareware and stubborn parser games. I didn't really speak the language of pop culture. I was a very, very nerdy child, and I struggled with feeling like I didn't match the prescriptions for womanhood either. In a photo album, my parents have a picture of me and my sister doing this Jane Fonda workout tape where I'm like 10, she's 4, and it's kind of sad. Where I came from, every girl had to go to dance class and look like this and get yelled at by women with big hair. It was a war. I'll never forget how I had to learn the choreography to walk the dinosaur. And I wasn't supposed to be this kind of girl. This was how I walked the dinosaur. Super Mario World came out in 1990, just so you know in time where we're at for gaming. So on my first day of 7th grade, there's a story to tell you more about what type of outsider I was, and I know maybe other people might be able to relate. So it's the first day of 7th grade, so it's finally time for me to start school with the big kids, and I'm finally gonna be cool. So the teacher asks us to spend about 15 minutes writing papers about what we did over the summer. So I was so excited, you know, like little Hermione Granger writing her paper. And when we were done, the teacher says, you know, anybody want to read their paper out loud? And I'm like, oh. Everyone's looking around like, what's wrong with her? But yeah, I wanted to read my paper. My paper was about how I spent all summer pretending that the Dark Crystal was real in my backyard. Yeah, everyone else's was about visiting their grandma or going to soccer camp. Like, I was lucky that I had video games. I was lucky that games were there for me. Back then, I'd get myself to sleep at night by playing marathons of clacks with my sister, and then lying in bed by my clock radio with all the fuzzy stickers all over it, daydreaming about elves, listening to the radio until I fell asleep. And one night I was lying there like any other night, listening to some stupid grinning pop song or another, and this feeling came over me. I thought, if I don't do something, I am never going to feel like I belong in this world. And so I'd made what felt like a very conscious decision at the time to turn the dial of the radio to a rock music station that I had heard of. So the song that was playing was a song that I'd come to learn was called Low by the band Cracker. And it sounds kind of corny to me today, but at the time I remember thinking it had a really melancholy feeling to it, very touching. After that, Alice in Chains came on. Never heard anything like this man's voice before. At first, I didn't even know if I liked it, per se. They called it the alternative music station. I think it was for people who wanted a way out, people like me who wanted a way out of the pop values at the turn of the decade. Because there was a lot of people that didn't really like the 80s. The 80s for America were defined by this innocently glamorizing corporate climbing, capitalist ideals, the machines of industry. Your dad was in a business, your mom was at the gym, climbing a stair climber to nowhere. Actually, my dad was a journalist. He wrote about hi-fis, just like the dad in Gone Home, and he ended up having a home technology column in the Boston Globe back when the idea that you could have technology in the home at all was a novelty. Part of that was happening because video games were starting to come into the home for the first time when I was a kid and when my dad started writing. We had an Atari, we had a Commodore 64, we had an Apple IIe. It was a pretty great childhood. Dad would get all kinds of software from companies and individuals who were hoping that their games would make it into his home technology column in the Globe next to VCRs or whatever. He didn't actually write about games that much, but the boxes of discs would just pile up in our closet down in the basement office where we kept the computers and the washing machines. I would have to go and judge by the box art what it was going to be about, like just grab a new box one day and see if there was a new adventure inside. I mean, sometimes, you know, it was not always what you expect. I mean, like, if you look at the box to Centipede, he has a cape, the bugs have shoes, he's wielding some kind of magic wand, and then the game itself, no shoes, no wand. Yeah, but games were like adorable back then. They were like a newborn art form that was learning to talk. It felt like I was being raised by these witty, sadistic old aunts and uncles that I'd never get to meet. Almost immediately, though, games were sort of pushed into the service of showcasing hardware platforms. To this day, games are used to show off new hardware platforms. I mean, look at what they did for the iPhone. They're always the horsemen of hardware strategy. And by the end of the 90s, games would have developed the exact lavish obsession with fancier tech and graphics that the hardware arms race wanted it to. Games would quickly become instruments of the man. But I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. The plentitude of the 1980s and the advent of that technology really influenced its culture. Basically, every movie was about a boy hero with like a Nintendo Power Glove type situation. We ate Nintendo cereal, we watched G.I. Joe. If you were like me and you weren't that into ponies, your other choice was basically princess rescuing, muscle flexing, dude hero, dominant paradigm. This is what there was to do in the 80s. Jump on dudes' heads, save the girl, get the power-up, win the game. And if you had money, you would have a game machine in your house, and you would even be more of a capitalist success story. Even the very fantasy of owning a game system was dangled by advertisers as something that would make you the coolest kid in school, or a cooler white boy, basically. If there were any girls or children of color in the video game ads, they were there to look awed or envious of the white boy who was winning at the video game. Video games were made by weirdos and outsiders and nerds, but immediately they became these artifacts of suburban achievement marched into the service of the system. At the same time, directly alongside all this, the musical aesthetic also prized a similar kind of weird swagger. Just like video games had something to say about the capitalist identity in America, so did music. By 1990s, this was how you be a cool guy. This is a band called Warrant. They put out the video for Cherry Pie that year. Like arena rock, hair metal, swagger. You had a muscle car, you had a woman in bikini on top of a car, and the woman would be doing things with fruit, or you could just use her as a table. It was how to be cool. I mean, these guys had like tight pants and full lips and long hair. This is our friends Poison. They put out the song Unskinny Bop in 1990. It drew an analogy between sex and putting gas into a car. But this was the rebellious masculine ideal at the time. You would just get super rich, attain a ton of women, and be a dragon-slaying fantasy He-Man. Of course, the older generation thought the headbanging noise was dangerous, so it was still considered rebellious to normative people, even while there were shiny cars and packed stadiums and women as trophies. It was still reinforcing the status quo in a lot of ways. So what I'm trying to say is that the 1980s, the values of the American capitalist 1980s are still in a big way fueling what popular games are still about. Like everything else from the 1980s, the most visible arms now of the game industry, and the games with the most fans generally, are driven by an obsession with advancing and accumulating hardware. They exist to serve and to express the capitalist ideal of bigger, better, more, and are still serving up these sort of corny male power fantasies made by people with money for people with money. If you come along, there's gonna be big engines, cool explosions, stuff like that. Have you ever been to E3, or have you ever seen any pictures of E3? So at the top of this slide is the video for Poison's Unskinny Bop, and at the bottom is a picture of E3. You can't tell the difference. It's Headbanger's Ball now at E3. It's still about aging men in tight pants who are really stoked about aliens and robots. The sad thing is that metalheads were nerds too. This was the aesthetic they were using to empower themselves. The problem with it was that it excluded anybody who just felt a little lost, or they wanted to talk about their mom or their feelings instead of eat pie off a girl. And there wasn't that much room for women in this aesthetic other than to be trophies, or for people of color, or for anyone who otherwise rejected the status quo in a bigger way. If you're struggling, the people that were struggling to relate to lyrics about pumping gasoline and having sex and things like that. Right now, I feel that video game culture is trapped at this pinch point in 1990. And again, I was playing Super Mario World back then. I was trying to straighten my bangs. I was waiting to see what was going to happen now that the 80s were over. My body was just about to come in. I could feel it, and I was waiting to see what all the aerobics queens and muscle car men and businessmen were going to do to it. These days, if I go to non-gaming events and I talk, a lot of women ask me, what's it going to be like for me if I join games? Are things getting better? What's it going to be like for my daughter? She loves games. She wants to work in games someday. What do you think? Is she gonna have a chance? I'm like, yeah. No, I mean, it's getting better, yeah. A lot of people felt lost in the 90s. The drivenness and the plentitude of the 1980s left a lot of people feeling adrift. Young people in the 90s had all the comfort that their parents raised them with, and perhaps, ironically, it bought us the leisure to have existential crises. This film, Reality Bites, is about people going through that, where you get out of high school and you kind of go, what now? We didn't necessarily want the buns of steel or to get into business. A lot of the media that began to emerge in the 90s asked really interesting questions like, if I reject this system, then who will I be? And what if I do nothing because I don't like this world my parents made? Popular films of the age, like Reality Bites or Slacker, Office Space, they were about the rebellion of not climbing, of hating the system and corporate culture, of refusing to achieve or to advance the technology. It was all about looking inward and thinking about who we really were and what we really want to do. The prevailing idea about the 90s was that more people had the economic stability to stop and go, hey, wait a minute, man, I need to feel my feelings. By the time I was 13 or 14 in 1994, I was coming home after school with friends to watch MTV. My favorite show was called My So-Called Life. It was the first program really to illustrate the life of a teen, not as a romantic after-school special, but as an awkward identity quest where people confronted drugs, became estranged from their parents, they dealt with their sexuality. It's things that had not been explored on TV in my life in America before. We also watched Beavis and Butthead, which had fun at the expense of two nerds in heavy metal t-shirts who drifted obliviously into one destructive escapade after another. So for fun, what we did was we went to the mall, because it's the only place to go if you live in a suburban small town. Every suburb has a mall. It's a sort of temple to the man, and kids go and not buy anything. And instead, we just drift around getting into trouble and hating everything. The first time I ever smoked weed was on the rooftop of the mall. There are a lot of mall-centric 90s films. Even the word mall tastes like the 90s to me. So slackitude and boredom came into vogue. The romantic ideal of my teen years was all dead guys. There was The Crow, An Interview with a Vampire, Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet movie, things like that. And so then in 1991, this blurry, cheap, lo-fi music video came out on MTV. It's just this weird guy with his hair in his face, like he doesn't even really want you to see him, playing in a gymnasium like they're making fun of your prom or something. This is Nirvana doing Smells Like Teen Spirit, the song that they go on to call the anthem of a generation. Smells Like Teen Spirit as a title is a satire of some antiperspirant ads that were on TV at the time all the time, starring happy teens running around being plentiful. And at first blush, the lyrics seem like general nonsense. But if you take a step back from them, it makes a strange kind of sense, like a Magic Eye poster. I feel stupid and contagious, here we are now, entertain us. It was like Kurt was looking to the excesses of the 1980s and the stupid superficial world of 1980s hypercapitalism and hair metal and going, well, what now? There were three members of Nirvana. Their music was sloppy, not very sophisticated. I had a lot of rock opera fans in my high school who would try to discredit the band's sudden popularity by pointing out that anyone can play Nirvana songs. Yeah, anyone can. I never played music in my life, but for my 13th or 14th birthday, I got a guitar and I played Nirvana songs. I sucked. It was awesome. I shaved half my hair off because I finally thought it was going to be okay if I did that. The same year, Guns N' Roses released two albums called Use Your Illusion 1 and 2. Massive, overwrought, lacy albums, iconic of egocentrism and excess. So the video for November Rain, which was a song off one of those records, came out in 1991, and it was this 9-minute long music video featuring a wedding and a funeral and Axl Rose mourning at a grand piano, very different from sort of this set of values. And yet it would go on to be Nirvana with these hoarse, stripped-down nonsense lyrics and crude little riffs that would usher in the 90s. It was time. Axl and Kurt would have very dramatic feuds, actually, which is funny because Axl from Guns N' Roses, he really liked Nirvana and he wanted them to play at his birthday party. But to Kurt, Guns N' Roses was everything that was wrong with music and he refused. Nirvana refused to tour with Guns N' Roses. Poor Axl, he tried a lot, but the bands always ended up insulting each other in the media. It really reminds me of some of the ideological tension that often appears to be going on between old guard game designer dudes and indies. The indies look at the industry and see the man. And the industry both, they wish they could be cool like indies, and they also resent their freedom. The headlines they keep reading about how the indies are going to end up making more money than them. So Kurt passed away about 21 years ago. Nirvana was recently inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He is the ultimate romantic hero of my generation in America. Most people my age and older, up to a point, remember where they were when they found out that he died. It was that kind of thing. Kids coming up today don't really know who he is or why anyone cared, but it was a generational voice. Do we have anyone in games that in 20 years we can go, yeah, they were a generational voice? Is there anyone in games that you can tell your kids about when you're old and not cool anymore? Of course, it is simplistic and inaccurate to say that any kind of movement began with Nirvana. Musical protest against the status quo were happening everywhere at the time in the early 90s, thanks to the flourishing of the underground do-it-yourself scene in the Pacific Northwest. It rains all the time there, and it seems like a really good environment for people who want to make songs about depression and feeling like outsiders. As my adolescence in the 90s progressed, though, I can't say I remember that much about what video games I was playing at the time. I must have played more of them than ever. And kept on playing RPGs and adventure games as first-person shooters began to rise. What I remember better, how I spent my time, was Aeon Flux, a surrealist animation we'd watch late at night on MTV after smoking weed out of modified cola cans. So Aeon was this mysterious woman heroine, but she wasn't there to titillate anyone, not without complications. She was alienating and unsettling, and the show could be kind of gross, but it was also powerful. By contrast, the gaming heroine of the 90s was Lara Croft. A lot of women talk about how empowering and memorable Tomb Raider was for them. And I don't mean to take that away from them. I'm sure that was the experience that they had. But for me, Lara was wealthy, was made through market research, and was never allowed to be so powerful that you couldn't put her on a poster in a fraternity house. Commercial games with women in them, to me, I don't see that many good examples in the commercial space. These days they're making a lot of positive backstory for Lara Croft, but I wonder if she wasn't an anachronism compared to other media even then. By the time I was into high school in 1994, Pearl Jam was the coolest thing in the whole world. Everyone makes fun of Pearl Jam now, but Eddie Vedder is so iconic of the time for me. He's this shy, famously fame-averse man. He wanted to sing about his relationship with his mother, and he had songs about how he was uncomfortable with guns or about how the world was ignoring the disadvantaged. Fairly famously, during a live performance on MTV in the early 90s, he was scrawling pro-choice messages on his forearm in the middle of a concert. And this was like a Billboard top 10 band, not an indie band. So that he took stands like that in public was pretty unheard of at the time, I think. This is what pop music was in the 90s. This alternative culture became the biggest thing that there was. At the same time, the 1990s were the golden age of Japanese RPGs. Not that the Japanese RPGs happened because of grunge or anything, but they had certain types of appeal in common. Japanese RPGs are stories about small-town kids who start out powerless. They leave their home. They go out in the world. They make friends and they gain, and they go from being disadvantaged to taking the system apart. The final boss in a Japanese RPG is always God or your dad or the system or the evil factory. That's the thing that you're doing. And they had those emotional stories almost to excess, because you make fun of emo Japanese RPGs heroes today. But I think all kids growing up in the 90s wanted to feel that they were subversive. They wanted to feel a sense of emotional discovery in what they perceived as a cold and unfeeling world. As alternative music began to settle in as the new commercial mainstream, though, a lot of these alternative music heroes wore the crown of fame really badly. The cool thing to do was fight your record label, fight ticket corporations. You don't show up to award shows. Pearl Jam refused to play any concerts for the entire time that I was into them because they were having an ethical feud with their booking firm. It was even cool to hate your fans. I mean, we even have a little of that these days in video games. I think it's good. I think it's a sign of a creative medium fighting back against product culture, and where people want to make things and share them, but they don't want to necessarily be in the customer service business. You can't blame someone for feeling that way. Pearl Jam was seen to resent the additional burdens that were placed upon them as a result of fame. And in his interviews, Eddie Vedder was really uneasy about all the other bands from the Seattle scene that got overlooked. He felt that people found Pearl Jam and stopped, and that there were other bands that were not getting enough attention. He was anxious at the idea of having won some lottery. And I think that's something that a lot of today's indie creators deal with, based on my conversations with them. Meaningful entertainment and culture generally does not like being commoditized. And I think that's something very important to remember in the discussions that we have about the games industry that revolve around what it owes us, or the parameters of the product or service that are being provided, or how we expect creators always to be in service to us or to be professionals. So after the death of her husband, Kurt rendered her a single mom, Courtney Love, Kurt Cobain's wife, began gaining more attention for her own music with the band Hole. Some people say that she was just honestly expressing herself, and other people say she was being opportunistic. But the fact remains that her 1994 album, Live Through This, was, for a lot of fans, a touchstone of grief about the death of Kurt Cobain and Nirvana, and some of her subsequent efforts to move on. I've read people reviewing it as a feminist album. Of course, everyone always said that Kurt probably wrote her songs. Kurt and Courtney were on drugs together, but while her husband was remembered lovingly, she's treated as a dramatic mess and a bad mother and all that. There is still a popular school of thought out there trying to prove that she was the one who killed her husband, even though there's no evidence for that. I think of her a lot as a woman in games. I'm outspoken, I have a strong personality, I drink, welcome to the games industry, and I'm not super interested all the time in being on good behavior, or I'll say harsh things. I'm not allowed to do any of that, even though my male colleagues are, and they are called really badass and really hilarious. I'm sure everyone who is not a man has experienced that double standard at some point in their life. The only period in her career where Courtney really got any respect was when she seemed to clean up and adopt a more normative aesthetic. She spent some time as a red carpet actress, and she conformed more neatly to how people expect women celebrities to be. I personally resist the idea that I or any other woman is supposed to be more professional or be a better service provider, and it's because of this principle. I would, whenever possible, rather people know who I am. The thing that sticks with me most about the music of the 90s is that we felt that we knew who these people were, whether we did or not. We felt that we did. The bands and the songwriters, they shared their demons with us. We watched them struggle in public. We could follow them through this entire body of work. Sometimes that was hard for them, like Eddie Vedder was one who often wrote about feeling like he was being pulled limb from limb, but it was defining for us. We didn't always even have to like everybody. Like, I really hated Smashing Pumpkins until I was an adult, and now I realize what an underappreciated band they are. But Billy Corgan was such a snob. He still is. He just did a Guardian interview about how no one appreciates him enough. You're nodding, right? Yeah, it was the best. He gives the best interviews. Please go and read Billy Corgan's latest Guardian interview. But still, part of our culture. I can smile and laugh about it. I feel fond about it. The grunge aesthetic looked like it was about not caring. You know, slacker clothes, unisex flannel. We made wallets out of duct tape. And the funny thing was, though, we cared a lot. All we did was care and sigh and experience feelings. And I miss caring about something that much. I think that we could be caring about games like that if we shifted our perspective. Okay, so the 90s, more than 2 decades ago, it's not like it was the best time ever. For example, there was an ongoing glamorization of eating disorders, glamorization of drugs and mental health problems. The 90s brought us the phrase heroin chic, and all of that had a very high fatality rate. And eventually, this counterculture became just as commercial as everything it tried to stand up against, and quickly too. I mean, have you seen Hot Topic? They ripped it off our bodies and sold it back to us, basically. It was good that I had this stuff as a child, but like, if it wasn't for Pearl Jam, we would never have to have Creed or Nickelback. So, you know, win some, you lose some. Culture is a volatile thing, and every trend that seems good can have a downside, or it can become negative if ever allowed to continue to its logical extreme. So Alternative Nation, as they called the community of my teen years, died with MTV, basically. But these days, I still have so many memories and stories and feelings to remark upon from that age, frankly, than I have about much of my lifetime in gaming. If I had a kid, I could make her a mixtape of my teen memories, you know, songs about being estranged from your dad, or about wanting to kiss someone you weren't supposed to want to kiss, or about feeling like the whole world is watching you and you aren't good enough. You know, I could give her that music, I could give her videos, fashions, news stories, and through the media that I consumed at the time would be one way of showing her who I was and how I felt and how I survived. But what games, if I had a daughter today, what games could I give her to tell her who I was, or what I was going through, or what was going on in the world when I was her age? Would there be anything in the games that are on shelves now for my kid to relate to? Honestly, these days, a lot of my friends don't know what I see in gaming or why I stick it out. And sometimes I have a hard day and I can't sort it out myself. But that's because I think for games, the 90s are just beginning. We have the opportunity to pioneer and celebrate and be welcomed and comforted by a visible, meaningful counterculture that is just kicking off. And there's one very important part of history that I've skipped over, and it's that before Nirvana and before all the sensitive, brooding grunge men from Seattle, we had something else. At the beginning of the 1990s, the Christian pro-life movement had really started to enter public conversation. People in the 80s had just learned about AIDS and they were frightened. And religion responded by pushing punishment toward what it saw as any kind of deviancy. Religion usually punishes women. So a lot of these sex-negative conversations were happening. At the same time, there were a couple major news stories. George Bush Sr. was trying to have confirmed to the Supreme Court a judge that was alleged to have sexually harassed a subordinate, Anita Hill, and he got confirmed anyhow. And she was, you know, I can't imagine what life was like for her at the time for even speaking about it. At the same time, I do remember these incredibly powerful women started showing up in my music magazines. I used to ride my bike to the little strip mall in our town and buy music magazines because the internet wasn't a thing yet, and this was the only way I got news about my heroes and pictures for my wall. At that time, centered mainly in the Pacific Northwest, the Riot Grrrl movement was beginning. There was this underground scene of these loud, wild, angry women bands responding to the events that were happening around them. Bikini Kill, Slater-Kinney, Bratmobile, just for example. They were sowing an indelible impression on the music scene of the area. Meaningful culture reflects and reacts to what is happening in society. It doesn't hand-wave away discussions and say, why do we have to talk about this? I just want to have fun. Let's maintain the status quo. Meaningful culture does not do that. And I'm sure it was fun as well to make zines and to go to Riot Grrrl shows and to kick doors in at the turn of the decade. It was fun and important. In hindsight, of course, the Riot Grrrl movement had its own problems. You know, like it was mostly white women, and anyone else had a hard time being welcome there. But as a general trend, it was an important one. Most people who talk about grunge or alternative nation or this part of my childhood that made me feel a little bit safer, they don't even realize it was these women that paved the way for it. It was Kathleen Hanna from Bikini Kill that spray painted Kurt Cobain Smells Like Teen Spirit on a wall and ended up naming the anthem of a generation, as far as I know. But hopefully you can see some parallels to some of the things that are starting to happen in video games right now. The feminist-led do-it-yourself scene is, to me, probably the most important thing going on in game culture. Thanks to accessible and cheap and free tools, there's a virtual flourishing of games made about personal experiences by talented artists and by everyday people, taking game making into their hands for the first time and using games to talk about their lives, to talk about themselves, and to talk about the world around them. We have, you know, a response to historical oppression. Games, let's be real, games have usually only been for one kind of person for most of my life, and now that's changing. It's a response to oppression. You know, culture reacts. We have culture here. You know, I don't even, when people say like, that's not a real game, or like, isn't it just like a, you know, people who aren't interested in like Twine or do-it-yourself games, I don't have, or they want to talk down on personal games, I don't have the patience for that anymore because they're clearly missing something. They don't understand. And it's like, I can't even talk to you about game culture if you don't also want to pay attention to this aspect of the scene. Game culture is happening at the grassroots. It's not at PAX where young guys are lining up to buy another Mario hat. Refusing to participate in a capitalist machine and instead looking inward at what we have to express as people is one of the truest and most important things a creative culture can do. A lot of these new games, just like the alternative music of the 90s, are about the things we couldn't talk about before. Identity, sexuality, depression, abuse. You can't bang your head to it, but it's important. This is what culture is, a shift, at least temporarily, from production values to actual values. And a lot of the old guard starts to wonder, like, well, if anyone can make a video game, then what are video games? Like, grunge wasn't real music just because I knew how to play it. You know, it wasn't real because I could do it. Because I could access it, it became part of my history. And that's why it mattered. Or like indies, anyone know Michael Bro? He's like one of my favorite indie creators. Indies tell him, his work is very intentional and considered, and it has this lo-fi aesthetic on purpose. But indies say, like, maybe it'd be more commercially viable if you tightened up the graphics on level 2. That kind of attitude is why Kurt Cobain refuses to play with Guns N' Roses. Like, all this stuff is going on, but I can't really sell a lot of articles about it because what proud gamers want to do is watch the 9 millionth Minecraft marriage proposal. People on Twitter are seriously asking me which of 2 identical next-gen game consoles is better. Don't know, don't care. I mean, you should be pissed off that people think BioShock Infinite is important, frankly. I am pissed off. Like, why don't I like the egocentric, overwrought BioShock Infinite? It's like Use Your Illusion 2 of video games. You know, get mad at the things that people expect you to accept as the best we can do. That's where culture starts. So, The biggest grunge success stories were all still men, but they were men who were consciously rejecting the chicks on cars narrative in favor of making songs about politics or abuse or things that hadn't been explored before. They were critical of that capitalist masculinity often, and they also sought to question the status quo by protesting violence. Guns sort of represent your sense of privilege over someone else in a lot of ways. I'm powerful because I can end your life. The whole idea of wielding a gun is bound up in racism and classism. And many of the songs of the 90s were about dismantling the American obsession with arms. As you know, my country has a problem with that. So a lot of the bands at the time criticized the way that authority creates fear, like Rage Against the Machine, for example. Part of the role of rock music in the 90s was to rouse the youth to question these systems of authority and fear. I think we could use some of that in games right now as well. Guns are what video games are mostly about. It's not only offensive because we can't extricate it from that ideology, but point and click, that's the best we can do? This is the art of commercial game design? Obviously, I'm not saying all gun games are bad. Again, I have a Metal Gear Solid tattoo. We can't enjoy them. Of course we can enjoy them. Or that fantasy violence should cease to exist. No, we should have more fantasy violence. We should have smarter and more interesting fantasy violence. But how many guns does it, you know that joke that everyone makes when someone's talking about a really smart indie game and someone goes, how many guns does it have, like as a joke? The joke is pretty on point. So this slide used to have excerpts of a lot of the hate speech posted to an employee of one of Activision's Call of Duty studios as a result of, he changed some of the guns, so he got a lot of hate speech, but the language was pretty worrying for maybe some people, so I took it out. But I'm sure you can imagine, I don't understand what it is about commercial games where that is acceptable or desirable. No one is saying that culture cannot include stupid entertainment. It's that stupid entertainment and the fervent obsession with fun and meaninglessness is controlling the industry. Helping keep this stuff popular is the single biggest way to assure that commercial games, it'll be hard to make them mean anything to anyone. So yeah, as long as we pretend that games exist in a vacuum that has nothing to do with what happens in the rest of the world, we'll never have a culture worth talking about. And I know that we want to celebrate games, and it sucks the way that games are made the scapegoat again and again for wider problems in culture. We've all just been wanting a safe place, and continually being told that we're problematic or we're hateful or we're meaningless is painful, of course it is, and it makes people defensive, I understand that. But let's make sure we're defending the right things, not games that mainly exist to make rich dudes richer and to exploit you as a market category. These are not your people. These people do not care about you. Do not go to bat for a corporation. Why do people think that they need to defend Microsoft? Why do you think they need defending? Why would you rather strengthen a brand than our culture? Not you, but why would one? Anyway, here we are now. I can draw a line from 1980s hair metal to 1990s counterculture, and it encompasses music, films, TV, technology, the spirit of the times, and even product culture as well as one entity that says something about how people felt in the times and what was important to them, and yet games still exist separately from that. I think right now, for the most part, games can only talk about games, and gamers can only talk about being gamers. And I don't think this is where things have to stop, but we need to be part of the counterculture movement. This doesn't have to mean we're always serious, or that we're always angsting and bearing our souls if we don't want to. Like Beck, for example. Beck is a great musician who was popular in the 90s. His biggest hit was, "I'm a loser, baby, so why don't you kill me?" I mean, he played with a plastic spork in his guitar, but it was just a weird 90s thing to do at the time. The idea of just being a loser who's going nowhere was funny. There were tons of silly nonsense songs laughing at boredom and coming from a sincere place. Sometimes diversity in games is just, sometimes people think, speaking of boredom, I get a lot of people who think that asking for diversity in games means I'm being sensitive, or I just want things to change because I'm offended by the content, or I just want everyone to feel special. No, the point is that without new voices, things are going to get boring. A couple days ago, I watched this Swedish movie, and it was about little girls playing punk music, and it was really charming. I really recommend it. It's called We Are the Best. At first, they'd take up their instruments just to annoy these older boys who called them ugly. And the older boys were just in a very typical metal band. And these girls are clearly heroes of the story. Do you want to play as them, or do you want to play as the old metal band? I'd rather play as someone new. And every time I hear someone say feminists want to censor everything, it's like, no, I'm just sick of hearing this one thing. I want more voices, more ideas, and new things. For me, this has nothing to do with covering up all the video game boobs. I want games to live longer. I want them to get more interesting. I want them to have more players, more everything. I want them to have a counterculture. These days, I think of that time when I was a child lying in the dark, and I felt that emotionally I wasn't going anywhere. So I reached out my little clock radio and I changed the dial. And I want that for everyone. I want us to tell everyone, if you really love games, turn the dial, celebrate alternative culture and be part of that. And I think you can't have alternative culture without a desire for justice. So I hope you share my appetite for justice and my belief that games are only at the beginning of their cultural potential. And that's all I have to say. Thank you. I do want to share some references that were important to me in developing this talk. Stephen Hayden, H-Y-D-E-N, is a rock critic, and he has a collection of essays on 90s music called Whatever Happened to Alternative Nation. And that was crucial for me, kind of catching up on the cultural context for the music that I was talking about. As I was reading it, I just saw the parallels that started to form this talk. You can download it on Kindle from Amazon, and it's also, I think, on the Onion's AV Club. I also want to clarify that all the 90s stuff is not exactly a perfect analogy, nor is it meant to be. There's also, there's a lot of reasons why I don't like the who is the Nirvana of video games question, so I guess keep that in mind. You could poke all kinds of holes in my analogy if you want to, but I like to think, I hope that you got what I was trying to say. I can take questions, I think, for about 15 minutes if anybody has any. Yes? That is a long shot. Is that a microphone?
Yeah.
Oh my God, that's so cool.
It's an innovation thingy, whatever.
Wow. Technological innovation, it begins right here.
Am I talking to the wrong end of the soft box? That's kind of
Maybe it's not on.
No, I can also speak up, but
I can hear you.
my name is Ollie. I'm the guy who tried to email you about the interviews, but that's not important here.
Okay.
I was just gonna ask you about, given the whole Gamergate thing that's been going on since last year, how do you keep the faith now?
That's a really good question. It is often very hard. I play a lot of games. I play as many games as I can. I try to remember what I'm doing this for. I play games that people have never heard of that were made by some stranger who I think deserves a chance. I go to game jams. I meet with younger people, kids and young women, and I watch groups of 28-year-olds trying to design a video game, and it inspires me because I see that the future is not going to be like this. But yeah, I play a lot of games, and I meet students actually, honestly, because I'm always pleasantly surprised these days when I go to schools because the students are smarter and they're more progressive than the industry legends that I'm surrounded by. So I look at younger people and I think it's getting better. Another question?
Let's see if this works.
Thank you for your help.
Oh, okay. So you are basically doing a cultural revolution in a sense.
Sort of.
Yes, okay.
Maybe a little.
So when you are pushing values in the gaming industry and in the gaming press, don't you need to be criticized objectively? And what do you think about ethics in video games?
Yeah, I'll answer that. What is objectively? Tell me, what is an objective opinion?
Objective opinion means that you are taking yourself off your agenda and you are looking yourself.
How would I have an opinion that wasn't informed by my beliefs? Should I pretend I'm not myself when I'm playing a video game?
No, but you should take yourself away from your personal feelings and what.
So I shouldn't. So if I'm playing a game, I'm not going to have feelings about it, only thoughts.
No, you will have feelings, of course.
And where
Most
do
of the
those
games
feelings
are.
come from?
Those feelings they are psychological, of course, and your
And they're
social
informed
connections.
by my.
Social connections, yes.
Yeah, and my experience.
Yes, your
and
experience and social connections.
My
but
identity.
but my point was if you are pushing a counter-revolution, in a sense, in a gaming culture, so why are you doing it? Why don't you just make your own circle of culture in a gaming industry?
Oh, I am, and I have.
Why are you
Excuse
trying
me.
to, in Dikra...
I'm answering your question.
Yeah, okay.
So the thing about why don't you make your own circle, I am and I have and I do. Certainly, I'm very transparent about my agenda, my politics, and my beliefs, and if you don't share them and you would like to hear reviews from someone else, the option is simply not to read my work and to read someone else's instead. But the idea that someone can be objective when they're talking about an emotional creative medium is fallacious, and it is a heritage of product culture where we believe that there's one right way to see a game, you put a number on it and you buy it or not, and I just don't believe in seeing games that way. There are a number of websites that do though, so you just don't, you know, if you're of the opinion that agenda doesn't belong in games, then, I don't know, read GameSpot.
Hi.
Hi.
Elsa. Okay, very much related to the first question, but when you are in that situation where people ask you about ethics in gaming and so on, and there's just that, how do you deal with that fear? Because for me, I'm studying computer engineering right now, and you're just constantly surrounded by that, and it can get so overwhelming. Like, do you have coping mechanisms for that?
You know, just this morning, I posted on Facebook that every time I give a talk now, I'm scared because I don't know what to expect. You know, obviously I don't want to go someplace where everybody agrees with me. It's fine for me to be asked questions like that. But I wish I could say I had a magic solution to deal with the fear, but I don't. It's part of my life now. I persist in spite of that. I surround myself with things that inspire me. I make sure I play a lot of the games that I like. I don't know, I have a lot of good colleagues, and you know, I belong to some support groups for women facing similar challenges who, you know, you might not know what it's like, you know, being a woman in games and not knowing if you're about to walk into a room with one of those guys, you know, that you read on the internet, because they're there, you know, and even people who aren't going to hurt you, you know, might want to confront you and tell you you're wrong in a way that you might not experience if you had a less controversial opinion or if you had a less controversial gender. It's scary, yeah, I don't have a good answer for you, but you can do it. If I can do it, you can do it, you know?
Okay, yes, so I want to know if you're like trying to reform gaming culture, do you think that there's enough consumer demand for this kind of culture that you're trying to advocate?
Well, I want to make a slight correction in that I'm not trying to change what exists. I think commercial gaming culture will always exist. I hope it does always exist. It should always exist for the people that enjoy it. We are proposing alternatives. We are making games bigger by adding more to it and inviting more people to it, and making it broader and making it reach more people, having different markets of games. So yeah, there's a demand for it. I make my whole career on it, so I hope it grows.
Yeah, but I'm just like, if you, what reads on the screen right now that you want us to find an alternative.
Yes.
So isn't there like a risk that if you're going to push this niche view in gaming, you're also going to have a niche audience?
I mean, I think games currently already have a niche audience. They're about like one or two different things for about one or two different kinds of people. I think that we can only benefit by making games more interesting, more sophisticated, and more diverse. It's not about pushing something artificial into a space that doesn't want it. It's about enriching every space with a broader variety of perspectives. So it's not like you're going to suddenly force Call of Duty players to play a game about feminism or something. You know what I mean? But I think there's room for all kinds to exist in the same space and to learn from one another.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Currently, there's like this discourse on feminism, gender issues, and such.
Sorry, what did you say after feminism?
Gender issues and
gender issues, yes.
and stuff like this.
Yep.
You know, I'm not saying that that's war that's already been won.
Right.
But what do you think where do you move on from there? Might class be the next?
Yeah, I mean, I
easy.
personally believe in intersectionality, which means it's never just about gender, that it's about where your position in society and what advantages you do and don't have. So yes, I think it's never just about gender for me. It's about class as well and race as well. And you know, it's interesting, once you look at it, you know, there really is a high cost of participation in video games that is really, the tickets are only easily available to certain people. Let's say if you grew up poor and you don't have the hardware, how are you going to get access to this? How are you going to learn to make video games? You know, you hire people who are like you. You know, if in a job you look to your friends or your colleagues or people you've worked with before. You don't think about, you know, maybe I'll look to a completely different part of the world and find, you know, give an opportunity to someone. So it's, yeah, I mean, I definitely don't think women in this room, would you mind putting your hands up if you think we've won and it's finished? So, yeah, I think according to most of us, we still have some work to do to make the game industry feel like a constructive place for everyone. But I do take your point that, you know, class also matters and race also matters, and that when we're looking to refresh our space with fresh perspectives and to consider people who haven't been heard before, we have to think beyond just women. For me, that's what the word feminism means. It's maybe an imperfect word in that regard, but intersectionality.
You touched upon DIY culture at the early 90s, and there's a perception in Finnish games industry that it has grown out of the hacker culture. For example, we have the assembly event twice a year, and you have all these kind of cultural competitions where people do computer graphics and computer sound, and people mess around and participate in this community. Do you have an opinion on that kind of a digital culture and its role in finding alternatives?
Interestingly, the more I travel, the more I find that each country or each sort of development scene, whether it's centered around a city or a school, they have their own DIY culture. They have their own creative norms that are informed by their environment. The style is informed by how they're educated, whether there is a big AAA studio near them or not, because that informs what kind of abilities and skills go into the local scene. So yeah, I think that hacker culture is definitely a viable grassroots scene. You know, like the people who are indie in New York have different values from the people who are indie in San Francisco, have different values from the people who are indie in Copenhagen. So it's really interesting for me to actually look around and sort of get to know different cultures by exploring their gaming culture.
Hi.
Hi.
I wanted to ask you something about, well, in fact, I really enjoyed the comparison to the music scene.
Oh, thank you.
And just thinking about that MTV was the one that made a lot of alternative music scenes really big in the end. Do you see any of that kind of things in gaming industry? We're pretty tied into ecosystems like Apple Store or Steam. Are we able to find channels that would help on discovery when it comes to alternative games?
You know, I'm hoping. I think YouTube has been really, really interesting for games, and the Let's Play style has allowed way more people to, like, I know that like young girls today watch like PewDiePie play video games, even though they don't play them themselves, and because they enjoy him. And I think that, you know, we have a couple of guys right now who do Let's Plays in a certain way, but you know, that isn't necessarily for everyone, but I think that the more popular that format becomes, there's going to be all different kinds of Let's Players as well, you know, playing from different perspectives or playing in different ways. And I suspect that rather than just the informal sort of YouTuber that we have now, we're going to have more channels that are more targeted for more specific discovery that, you know, people will watch and enjoy based on their own interests, so that hopefully there's a world where everyone, no matter who they are, can find a game for them, where everyone can make a game and have it connect with the right audience, you know, no matter what kind of thing that you like to do. But yeah, I see it sort of happening in social media and in social video, hopefully. I can take one more.
Hi there.
Hi.
So, as we are in Finland, like Finnish game industry is like, I don't know, 90% mobile. So most of the companies actually doing mobile games. And the challenge with mobile games is that majority of those mobile game companies are actually focusing on very broad audience.
Yeah.
And there we come
broad
with
in the, not broad in the let's make something exciting creative way.
No.
Yeah.
But from like, yeah,
Yeah.
age-wise or geographically or whatnot.
Yes.
And the problem comes from discoverability.
Yes.
That's one of the biggest problems the game developers have at the moment.
Yes.
And the question basically is about, so where a person like you, as a writer, where should you actually be writing about these games that you basically both educate the people who play all kinds of games, but do not read games press or games websites?
I'm not sure I understand your question. You're asking where I find out about mobile games?
No. The question is about, so I think the challenge at the moment is that those game developers, they are basically focusing on very broad audience, but currently the games websites or magazines are focused on games which are targeted to a specific audience, which are sort of the gamers.
You're wondering about the future of journalism for newer audiences and different audiences.
Yeah.
It's funny. In terms of the mass market mobile game audience, I wonder if the person who plays Candy Crush or Angry Birds or something like that, I wonder if that person reads reviews or reads gaming articles. I don't necessarily know whether there's a market there for that yet, but I do know that curation is the most important sort of frontier for our current digital society. People used to find things on Twitter or by RSS feed, and nobody actually uses those things anymore. So I think there's going to have to be some kind of curation solution that comes up to help people find the kind of content that they want. I don't know if necessarily that's going to be games journalism. I mean, even honestly, I just don't know if that's relevant anymore for finding that, for that type of person finding that type of game. I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't have a really smart answer to that.
Thanks.
Thank you. Well, that'll do it for me. I really appreciate your attention and your smart questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks still, Leigh, a lot on my behalf, and thanks for all of you and those of you who are watching the stream. And if you have time, please join us for a coffee behind the corner, and we'll continue the discussions there. It's big topics when you start looking not just at games, but the whole culture. It's really important stuff to look at the big picture now and then. But yeah, let's continue the discussions, and the next Games Now lecture will be again in a couple of weeks, so see you then. Thank you.